The mountains of Colorado do not forgive. They do not negotiate. They simply wait, and what cannot survive them does not. It is November. The year is 1883, and somewhere above the Denver and Rio Grande Western line, where the tracks cut through the mountain corridor at 8,000 feet, a woman stands alone in the dark, not lost, not broken, waiting. In her right hand, extended toward the shadows, is a 3-inch steel hairpin, the only thing she owns that could pass for a weapon. The only thing standing between her and whatever is breathing in the brush 15 feet away. A shot rings out from somewhere above. One single crack splitting the cold air in half. The breathing stops, and then, heavy footsteps, coming down through the timber, slow and deliberate, the tread of something that has never once needed to hurry. She does not run, she does not call out. She stands in the dark and waits for it to show her what it sent. The last thing Ruth Ashford owned that meant anything was a 3-inch steel hairpin, pointed at one end, cold in her fist. She held it extended toward the darkness the way you hold something when you have decided it is better than nothing, which is not the same as believing it will be enough. Because out here, with the mountain pressing down and the cold pressing in, and something breathing in the brush 15 feet uphill that was absolutely not the wind, it was the only thing between her and whatever came next. And she had not walked 3 miles in disintegrating Boston shoes on railroad ballast in November, Colorado to die holding a hairpin. So she held it like it meant something, because out here, it did. The breathing came from the uphill side of the tracks, slow and even. The sound of something that had stopped moving because it had found something worth stopping for, not the sound of an animal passing through, the sound of an animal conducting an assessment. She recognized this the way you recognize things your body understands before your mind catches up, through the specific quality of stillness that arrived in her chest the moment she registered the sound. A stillness that had nothing to do with calm, and everything to do with the part of the nervous system that has been handling these calculations since before the concept of a woman alone in the dark in the mountains was invented. She stopped walking. The breathing stopped. Two things not moving in the dark, taking stock of each other through 30 feet of frozen mountain air. She found the hairpin by feel, drew it from her hair with one hand. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders and the cold found it immediately, and that was not the problem. Extended her right arm. 3 inches of steel pointing at the brush. The particular arithmetic of inadequacy. But it was what she had. And she had learned in the last 3 weeks that working with what you had was the only arithmetic that mattered, because the alternative was to do nothing, and she was done with the alternative. The shot came from somewhere above and behind her, not at her, into the timber canopy above and to the left. A single crack that split the cold air in half and sent every sheltering bird in the surrounding spruce into panicked flight at once, a sudden dark explosion of wings against the already dark sky. The brush erupted. Something large departing at speed through the undergrowth. Crashing downhill toward the river she had been hearing but not seeing since the second mile. Gone in 4 seconds. The sound of it swallowed by distance and timber and the profound indifference of the mountain. She had not moved, still holding the hairpin with her arm extended, heart doing something complicated in her chest that she would file under physiological response and examine later when later was available, which it currently was not. Footsteps on the slope above her, heavy, deliberate. The tread of someone who has never once needed to look at the ground to know where his feet are going, who moves through dark timber the way water moves through rock, finding the path not by searching but by simply knowing it is there. He came through the tree line and stopped at the top of the embankment above her and looked down, and what Ruth Ashford saw stopped the breath in her throat for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. He was enormous. Not in the way that people sometimes describe men who are simply tall. Enormous in the way that redefines your understanding of what a man can be, the way the first time you see a genuine mountain you revise every previous idea you had about height. He stood at the edge of the embankment above her, and the dark sky behind him was partially obscured by the width and height of him. And she was aware of this in the specific way you become aware of something that does not fit the category you had prepared for it. The rifle was in his right hand, lowered against his thigh, not pointed at her, not away from her, simply held by a man who apparently had strong and specific convictions about where things belonged when they were not in use. He wore a coat assembled from the hides of several different animals over what appeared to be a considerable span of years, with varying results in terms of aesthetic cohesion. Dark hair past his ears, a beard that had last seen a blade in what she estimated was late summer. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has found something unexpected in his territory, and is determining its category before he decides how to proceed. Taking stock of the situation the way you take stock of weather coming off a ridge. Assessing direction, speed, probable consequence. He did not come to her, he did not offer his hand or make any gesture that social convention or emergency protocol might have suggested. He stood where he was and looked at the situation with the unhurried accuracy of someone who has found that most situations, examined clearly enough, reveal what they require. Mountain lion. The voice matched. Low and rough and unpolished, the kind that doesn't bother raising itself because it has never needed to. Juvenile? You were moving like something injured. Slow and uneven. That's interesting to a mountain lion still working out what it can manage. She lowered the hairpin slowly and you shot above it. Warning, it was still evaluating. You don't shoot a mountain lion that's evaluating unless it commits to an approach. This one hadn't. He paused. His eyes had moved to the hairpin still in her hand. What were you planning to do with that? I hadn't finished deciding. Something shifted at the outer edges of his expression. Not a smile, not close enough to call a smile, but the geography immediately adjacent to one, the slight reorganization of a face that has not made that particular configuration in long enough that the muscles remember the direction without completing the motion. The train left you, he said. The train ejected me. There is a distinction. He looked at her coat, her shoes. The general condition of someone who had been put off a moving train in the mountain corridor of Colorado in November, and subsequently walked 3 miles on railroad ballast in footwear designed for Boston parlors. His assessment was thorough and not particularly warm, but it was accurate, and she had learned in the last 3 weeks that accuracy was worth more than warmth, when warmth was decorative and accuracy was functional. How long have you been walking? Since approximately 4 o'clock. He read the sky the way she had watched experienced men read clocks. A glance, a calculation. 6:15. Nearest settlement is Black Ridge. 2 days south in reasonable conditions. He looked at her left knee, which had been providing continuous and increasingly detailed commentary since the 2nd mile. In your current condition, and in those shoes, you will not have functional feet by morning. The temperature will drop another 15 degrees before midnight. She knew all of this. She had been doing this arithmetic since the 1st mile and arriving at the same unwelcome result every time. Hearing it confirmed by someone who clearly knew this terrain with the intimacy of long acquaintance did not make the result worse. It simply removed the small remaining comfort of uncertainty, which she had been spending carefully, and which was now gone. I'm Ruth Ashford, she said, because the situation seemed to require a name. He considered this for a moment in the particular way that some people process names, as though they are information that arrives at its own pace and gets sorted by its own system. Cole Maddox, flat. I have a cabin on the ridge above this section. 40 minutes in normal conditions. He looked at her knee again, the way a man looks at a structural problem he is calculating the load-bearing implications of. And then he was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are working towards something they haven't quite decided to say. My terms, he said. I need a second person through the winter. Not a guest, labor. There are 2 elk hanging in the storage shed that need butchering and salt curing before they spoil. The trap line needs checking every 3 days or the catches freeze in the mechanisms and the whole line becomes worthless. The fire needs maintaining when I'm on the line. He paused. Running this operation alone means insufficient sleep. Insufficient sleep at this altitude creates the kind of errors that end conversations permanently. She watched him. He was not performing this offer. He was stating it the way a man states the terms of a contract when he expects both parties to understand exactly what is being exchanged, and neither party has any illusions about the other's motivations. What is the other side of those terms? Shelter, heat, food through spring, whatever medical attention I can provide, which is field level but considerably better than what you currently have access to. She thought about Silas Crane's office on State Street, the particular patience of a man who has already decided. She thought about 17 days, and about the brown paper the court officials had wrapped around her father's furniture, with the impersonal efficiency of people who do this every week, and have stopped seeing the objects as belonging to anyone. I don't know how to butcher an elk, she said. I assumed, I'll show you once, only once. I don't repeat instructions. Paying attention the first time is part of the arrangement. This was, objectively speaking, a harsh policy. It was also the policy of someone who had learned that survival does not accommodate second chances at most of its examinations. She recognized the logic of it even while noting its inflexibility. I'm a quick learner, she said. You'll have to be. He turned and started up the slope without waiting for her formal agreement, which was either confidence in her decision-making capacity or simply the acknowledgement that the decision had already been made by the temperature and the mountain lion and the arithmetic, and waiting for her to say it out loud was a formality that neither of them needed. She followed him, because the alternative was to die in the mud beside a railroad track in Colorado, and she had not come this far to give Silas Crane the satisfaction. 3 weeks, 22 days to be exact, since she had been standing in the parlor of her father's house on Hanover Street in Boston, watching 2 men from the court system wrap the furniture in brown paper. The grandfather clock, which her father had purchased secondhand from an estate sale in 1871, and which had kept imperfect but earnest time for 12 years. The writing desk where she had sat at the edge as a girl on Saturday mornings, listening to Henry Ashford work through the week's accounts out loud, not teaching her deliberately, but simply thinking in her presence and allowing her to absorb whatever she could absorb. The painting of the Connecticut River Valley, which he had bought at auction in 1868, because it reminded him of a summer he had spent there as a young man. A summer he never explained and which she had never asked about, because some silences between fathers and daughters work better left intact, the weight of them load-bearing in ways you only understand when they're gone. She had watched the men take it all and she had not cried. Henry Ashford had built a dry goods business from a rented cart and $40 of borrowed capital over 31 years. He had been methodical and honest and careful in ways she had absorbed through proximity rather than instruction. She had spent her adolescence at the edge of his desk while he worked, learning the difference between a contract with good bones and one with rot in the foundation. He had given her the ledger to check at 12 years old, and had not corrected her mistakes immediately, but had asked questions that led her to find them herself. At 14, when she found the first significant error in a supplier's invoice, he had looked at her over his glasses and said only this: "You'll be useful to someone someday. That's better than being decorative. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He had died of a failing heart on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The doctor called it sudden. Ruth, who had been watching him slow down for 2 years, understood it the way you understand a winter coming. Not because you can name the exact day, but because the light changes quality before the temperature drops. What she had not known was the debt. A business loan taken 6 years ago during a difficult stretch, restructured twice, never resolved. The firm of Whitfield and Sons out of Boston's commercial district held the paper. When Henry died, their representative, Edmund Silas Crane, moved with a precision that suggested considerable preparation. He called the debt in full 17 days after the funeral. Exactly 17. The minimum legally permissible window before a creditor could initiate collection proceedings against an estate, which meant that someone at Whitfield and Sons had been counting. Ruth had tried to negotiate them. She had gone to their offices on State Street with the account books and sat across from Crane, who wore a suit that cost more than her household ran in a month, and who listened to her with the patience of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply allowing the formalities to conclude. The books showed the business was viable, revenue sufficient to support an 18-month payment plan with room. Crane had looked at the books and said, in the tone of someone explaining arithmetic to a capable person he has chosen to treat as incapable, "Miss Ashford, I understand this is a difficult time." And then he had explained why none of what the books showed was legally relevant to what Whitfield and Sons was entitled to collect. She had walked out and down State Street and had not stopped walking until she reached the harbor, where she stood looking at the water for 20 minutes. And then, leaving the office building, she had stopped. Because through the heavy door left half open behind her, she had heard 2 voices. Not bothering to be quiet, the voice of one man to another when they believed themselves unobserved. And what she heard had changed the shape of everything. "How long has Crane been watching the Ashford account?" The second voice, lazy with confidence, "Since August." He knew the old man was sick. Had the filing drafted before the funeral. August, Henry Ashford had died in October. Crane had prepared the collection filing in August. 2 months before Henry was dead, Crane had already known he was dying. Someone had told him. She had stood in the corridor with that knowledge, and it had taken the shape of something that was not grief and not anger, but something between them. Something colder and more permanent. The feeling of understanding for the first time the full dimension of what had been done. Not a creditor collecting a legitimate debt with legal efficiency. A predator who had been circling for months, who had information he should not have had, who had used that information to position himself perfectly, for the moment her father took his last breath. She had walked to the harbor and looked at the water. The situation had resolved into its only remaining shape, Denver, an aunt she had met once at a funeral when she was 9 years old. The aunt had pinched her cheek and said she had her grandfather's stubbornness in her chin. Whether this was a compliment had never been clarified. Whether the aunt still lived at the address on the card was equally unclear. Whether any of this constituted a plan was a question Ruth was actively choosing not to examine with too much precision. 3 weeks later, she was in a baggage car with $211 in her coat pocket and a Denver address in the inside pocket, and a ticket that had taken her as far as her money allowed, past the last station she could properly afford, riding on the calculation that an arrangement might be worked out. The kind of arrangement that railroad employees sometimes accepted in the gray area between official policy and human discretion. Not a certain plan, a possible plan. She understood the difference. Conductor Webb had arrived to clarify the difference. He was a broad man who moved through narrow spaces with the confidence of someone who has never once considered that he might be inconveniencing the space around him. He wore his uniform with the satisfaction of a man who has found that a uniform confirms things he has always believed about himself. His eyes were small, and they were doing the particular arithmetic of a man who has found exactly the situation he was hoping to find. Ticket, not a question, a countdown. She had stated her case with the voice Henry Ashford used when negotiating from a position of less leverage than he preferred. Steady, practical. She offered an arrangement, accounting work, manifest documentation. Whatever the journey required. He repeated work arrangement back at her without inflection. He gestured, not toward the rear of the car or the door connecting to the passenger coaches, toward the side door, the one in the wall that opened directly onto the passing landscape of the mountain corridor. She understood what this was. This was not official procedure. Official procedure was a return to the previous stop or confinement until the next station. Any of a number of things that involved paperwork and witnesses, and the mildest possible version of inconvenience. This was Webb deciding in a baggage car with no one watching that policy had a certain flexibility in its application, specifically that it could be applied in whatever way satisfied him most. And then she had seen it. When he reached across her to push open the side door, his jacket fell open at the lapel. A folded envelope in the interior breast pocket, tucked but not quite hidden, the corner just visible. The letterhead in the upper left corner. Whitfield & Sons, Boston. She had not had time to fully understand what that meant. She had only had time to know that it meant something. That the shape of what was happening was larger and more deliberate than a conductor following policy. That someone had arranged for her not to arrive. And then his hand had connected with her back, and the door had been open, and the embankment had been there, and the mountain had come up to meet her. The slope had taken her sideways, and she had gone down hard. Shoulder first, hip. Then the left side of her face against gravel sharp enough to draw blood from her cheekbone. The world rotating through 3 axes, the train continuing. Its sound diminishing through distance to nothing. And then the mountains filling the silence the way mountains fill silences. Not loudly but completely, with the vast indifference of terrain that has existed since before the concept of a woman in difficulty was invented. She had stayed still for exactly 1 minute. Then she stood up and began walking west. Now she was following the largest man she had ever encountered up a slope through dark timber in Colorado. And her left heel had separated fully from the sole somewhere around the 3rd mile, and was flapping with each step against frozen ground. And her knee was providing a continuous and increasingly specific account of its grievances. And the cold had passed through the wool of her coat, and was working on the layers underneath in an organized and systematic way that suggested it had all night and no other appointments. Cole moved through the timber the way water moves through a landscape it knows well, finding the path between obstacles not by searching but by memory, ducking under branches she encountered with her face 2 seconds after he had cleared them without incident. His movement had no wasted motion, no hesitation. The specific economy of a man for whom this landscape was not a challenge to be overcome but a language he had been thinking in for so long it had become simply the way he moved through the world. She fell once on the way up. Not badly. Her left knee found a root under the snow cover and sent her down onto both palms, and the impact moved through the joint and up into her hip, and she came very close to making a sound about it. Very close. She pushed herself back to standing in 4 seconds and kept moving. From ahead, without turning, sweat freezes when you stop. Not offered gently, not offered unkindly, offered as information, which was apparently the register he used for most things. Somewhere in the final stretch, the physical complaints merged into a general background condition she was moving through, rather than attending to individually. And what she found herself doing in that space was talking to herself in her father's voice. Not the final version of him. The Saturday morning version. The one who worked through problems out loud with the calm confidence of someone who believed that any problem, understood clearly enough, had a manageable answer. This is where you are. This is what you have. This is what the next 10 minutes requires. She had always thought this was insufficient advice for complex situations. She now understood it was the only advice that mattered, because the alternative was to think about everything at once, which was what paralysis was. Halfway up, Cole paused. He was not waiting for her in any way that suggested concern. He simply stopped, the way a man stops when he is allowing for a known variable in his calculation. Standing with the stillness of someone who has decided she is coming and is providing the time it will take for that to happen. No encouragement, no impatience, just a large dark shape against the tree line, waiting with the patience of someone who has determined that waiting is the efficient choice. She caught up. And in the moment she came level with him, in the specific quality of moonlight filtering through the spruce canopy overhead, she saw it for the first time, his right wrist, where the coat sleeve had ridden up slightly when he shifted his weight to start moving again. A piece of fabric, small, tied loosely above the wrist bone, floral print, yellow flowers on a light ground, or that was how it read in the available light, which was limited. Not a bandage. Not anything with a discernible function. Something tied there with the deliberateness of a person who has made a decision about carrying it, and is not available for conversation about the decision. She looked at it for the length of one breath. Then she looked away and kept moving. Because there were questions that announced themselves clearly as questions for another time, and this was one of them. And she had learned from 31 years of watching her father read rooms that the question you ask before you have enough information is usually the wrong question. And the information you needed was in what you were not yet ready to see. The cabin appeared at the clearing's edge as a different quality of darkness, low and solid against the tree line. 12 feet by 16 she would later learn to estimate accurately. Built of unpeeled log rounds with a clay and moss chinking that had been applied in different stages over different years. Each patch visible in the subtle variations of color and texture that accumulate when a structure is maintained by one person over a long time, each repair a record of a winter that demanded it. The roof was sawn timber, low-pitched, carrying the weight of old snow with the composure of something that has done this many times and expects to do it many more. Cole produced a heavy iron key from somewhere inside the pelt coat. She noticed that he locked the door, which meant there were things he wanted kept out, and that this had been a deliberate decision at some earlier point in his life. And she filed this in the column of information she was accumulating about him, and did not yet know how to read. He put the key to the lock and shouldered the door open. It moved on leather hinges and made a sound that suggested it had been performing this function for years and had no complaints about continuing. Inside, a kerosene lamp on a low ceiling beam, lit with a match struck against the door frame in one practiced motion, no fumbling, yellow light expanding into the single room. A cast iron stove at the center cold. A table, low and scarred and functional, with 2 chairs of different origins and different heights. The bed built directly into the right-hand wall, covered in a chaotic accumulation of furs and wool that had been added to over time without any organizing principle beyond warmth. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. The smell of the room was old fires and pine sap and cured hide, and something underneath all of those, a specific quality she could not name yet. The smell of a space that has held one person's presence so long the space has conformed to it. And on the left wall, a narrow wooden shelf. 20 books approximately, not arranged by any visible system. Just placed. She read them as she read any environment, quickly and for information. Thoreau's Walden. Melville's Moby Dick. A collected Whitman with the binding cracked in the pattern of something that has been opened repeatedly. Not all at once, but over a long time. Page after page in different sessions until the spine finally acknowledged what it had been asked to do. Several other volumes she could not make out from the doorway in the available light. The books did not match the coat. She filed this, because it was information. And information was what you built understanding from. And she did not yet have enough to understand what she was building. Shut the door, Cole said, from the of where he was already at work with the damper and the kindling. The heat we don't have yet is already getting ahead of us. She shut it. The wind dropped to a muffled complaint against the exterior logs. The silence inside took on the dense and complete quality of a space designed, whether intentionally or through accumulated insulation, to keep out a very specific kind of sound. The fire started almost immediately. Small kindling first, then larger pieces. The practice sequence of someone who has built this particular fire so many times that the sequence no longer requires thought. The iron stove made a sound as it began to warm, metal adjusting to heat, and the first tentative advances of warmth began to reach the near edges of the room. He went to a bucket in the corner, broke a thin crust of ice on its surface with one knuckle, casually, without drama, the gesture of someone for whom this is a routine inconvenience and not a phenomenon worth remarking on. Brought her a tin cup of water, cold enough to ache in her cracked lips and all the way down. She drank all of it without stopping. He set the cup on the table and went to the storage crate that served as a cabinet. Pulled out a small tin with a pressed lid, set it on the table. Then he turned toward the pile of trap mechanisms in the corner. "Take your boots off." His back was to her. The pause before she responded lasted exactly as long as it took her to run through all the possible interpretations of that instruction and discard the ones that didn't fit the context she had available. He turned and read her expression and produced what she would come to recognize as his version of patience. Not soft, not warm, but not contemptuous either. Just tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with the hour. Your feet are frostbitten or getting there. That tin has rendered bare fat and willow bark. You rub it on your toes before the tissue damage passes the point where it's reversible. He paused. Because if your feet don't function, you can't stand at the salting table. And if you can't stand at the salting table, the arrangement we've just made becomes immediately impractical. He set the tin down with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. That is the reason. Then he went to the trap pile in the corner and sat down cross-legged and began working the mechanisms by lamplight. The sound of chain against chain. Steel against steel, steady and continuous. Ruth sat in the chair and began unlacing her boots. The leather of the left one had adhered to her stocking, where a blister had opened and drained during the walk. She freed it carefully. The stocking was wet through and gray from the gap in the split heel. She opened the tin. It smelled medicinal and animal. Nothing in her previous life had smelled precisely like this tin. She worked the grease into her toes with methodical care. Right foot first, because she still had sensation there and wanted to understand what she was working with before she addressed the left foot, which was substantially numb and whose returning sensation she was accordingly not optimistic about. The sensation returned on schedule, thorough and specific and unkind. She pressed her back teeth together and worked through it. From the corner, chain against chain, metal against metal. A man working by lamplight on mechanisms that needed his attention and were getting it. She looked at the books again. She had read Walden at 18, taken from her father's shelf one winter when she was tired of ledgers and wanted something made of different materials. She had found it alternately compelling and exhausting, which she had come to think was probably the correct response to it. A man who had lived in the woods and written about it with the conviction that this was information everyone needed, had something to teach about attention, and something to answer for about self-congratulation. Cole Maddox was a man who lived alone at altitude in a 12-by-16 log cabin and owned Thoreau and Whitman and Melville and had enough books to fill a shelf and then stack 4 more volumes on the floor beside it. And he wore a coat made of animals and had pine needles in his dark hair and moved through mountain terrain in the dark with the fluency of someone for whom the landscape was not separate from himself but continuous with it. This was information. She didn't know yet what it was information about. But she stored it with the deliberate attentiveness she had learned from years of watching her father read a room before he spoke in it. "Thank you," she said to his back when she had finished with the tin and replaced its lid. "Don't bleed on the blanket." He didn't look up from the trap mechanism. "It's the better of the two." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the stove. It was pushing actual warmth into the room now, not the warmth she had known. Not the warmth of the parlor on Hanover Street with its fireplace large enough to stand in, but warmth sufficient to move the immediate danger out of the category of immediate. And that was what the next 10 minutes required. And the next 10 minutes was all she was thinking about. She would be useful. She would pay the terms of this arrangement in full and in kind. She would not ask for more than was offered and would not perform weakness she did not have. This was what remained. You worked with what remained. Her father had never said this to her directly, but she had absorbed it anyway, the way you absorb everything that surrounds you long enough. Not as lesson but as habit. She closed her eyes. From the corner, chain against chain, metal against metal. A man working because the work needed doing, and he was the person who did it. And there was no one else. And from the look of this room, there had not been anyone else for a long time. She did not sleep immediately, but the cold had receded enough to stop commanding her attention, and in that small mercy she found the beginning of something she could not yet name. Not comfort, not safety, nothing so definite as either of those. But the absence, for the first time since Crane's office, of the feeling that the next hour was entirely beyond her management, the feeling that she was provisionally somewhere that had a floor. Outside, wind against logs, inside, fire in the stove growing. Ruth Ashford sat in a chair that had belonged to someone else before it belonged to no one in particular, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of pine and long winters, and looked at the iron belly of the stove going from dull black to a very faint dark red at its base. And she thought about nothing specific for a while, which was a luxury she had not had in 3 weeks, and which her mind took full advantage of without consulting her about it. Morning came without ceremony. The cast iron pan hit the stovetop at an hour her body registered as an offense before her brain had committed to wakefulness. The impact carried through the packed earth floor and up through her spine, and she was upright before she had fully decided to be, breathing fast in the cold air of the room, which had held through the night but only barely. The kind of warmth that keeps you from dying without achieving anything resembling comfortable. She was on the floor, she remembered this now. The chair had been fine for the first hours. But somewhere in the deeper part of the night she had relocated to the floor, because the chair's angle had been doing something unkind to her lower back. And the floor, while harder, was at least honest about what it was. Cole was already dressed and already at the stove and already moving through the cabin with the same economy she had observed on the slope, as though he occupied less physical space than a man of his dimensions should require. Moving in the small room with an awareness of his own size that had clearly been developed over a long time in spaces built for smaller people. He did not look at her. He slid a tin plate to the edge of the table, scorched cornmeal cake and a strip of dried elk from the previous night. "Sun's been up 12 minutes, he said. "Eat fast. The elk won't wait on your schedule." She pushed herself upright, both feet reported in. On consideration, they were functional. The bear fat and willow bark had done what he said it would do. And she noted this in the specific way she noted things that turned out to be accurate, adding them to the growing column of evidence about what kind of information Cole Maddox provided and how reliable it was. She ate standing up without comment about the quality of either item, because she was genuinely hungry in the way that cold exposure and significant physical exertion produce, the kind of hunger that strips all preference from the process and reduces eating to pure logistics. Outside, the cold was a different entity than the previous night's cold. Last night's cold had been aggressive and personal. This morning's cold was simply present, occupying the full landscape with the calm authority of something that has been here since before the concept of inconvenience was invented. The sky was white, not overcast but white, a flat winter light that came from everywhere at once and from nowhere in particular. And there, hanging from the crossbeam of the lean-to structure behind the cabin, were the 2 bull elk. She had understood there would be elk. She had not fully accounted for the reality of elk. Enormous in the way that animals in their actual context are always larger than any description of them suggests. Hanging inverted by ropes through their hind legs, both throat cut, the blood frozen into dark ropes along their necks. The hides had been partially opened along the belly. The first cuts of a job that needed finishing before cold and time collaborated against the meat. The smell arrived at 6 feet. Her stomach formed an immediate and comprehensive opinion. She stopped walking and breathed through her mouth and focused on the middle distance and waited for the opinion to pass. Because it would pass. Because the alternative to it passing was to let it win. And she had not walked 3 miles in disintegrating shoes and negotiated shelter with a man who was approximately the size of a significant geographical feature to be defeated now by a smell. So she waited, then she picked up the pace and went to meet what came next. 14 days. Not counted by any calendar, because there was no calendar in the cabin, which Ruth had noticed on day 2, and filed under the category of things that told you something about how a person had arranged their relationship with time. Counted instead by the slowly accumulating weight of small knowledges her body was acquiring, whether her conscious mind was tracking them or not. The fire needed feeding at intervals she had learned by experiencing what happened when she didn't. The water bucket froze to a depth that varied with the overnight temperature, and told her by the thickness of the morning crust what kind of day waited outside them. The trap line ran southeast from the cabin for approximately 3 miles along a ridge above the tree line, with a secondary line dropping into the lower drainage that Cole checked every third day regardless of weather. Because the mechanisms froze in their jaws if left longer, and a frozen trap was a lost catch, and a lost catch was a gap in the food supply that February would notice even if November didn't. She learned these things the way her father had taught her to learn business, not from lectures, from proximity and observation and the specific education of consequence. The first morning at the elk shed had lasted 4 hours. Cole had shown her the initial cut once as no narration, no scaffolding, just the demonstration, blade angle and pressure and the specific motion that kept the cut parallel to the ribcage and away from the stomach cavity. His hands on that work were different from his hands on the trap mechanisms, faster, more decisive. The movement of someone for whom this particular task has been performed past the point of conscious technique into something that simply happens correctly every time. He stepped back, held the knife toward her handle first. She took it. Bone handle. Worn smooth, the balance weighted toward the blade, which meant pressure had to come from the shoulder rather than the wrist. She positioned herself at the second elk and put the blade where he had indicated and pushed. The resistance surprised her. Not like anything she had previously cut. Not like any kitchen task or any approximation of kitchen task. Like something that had been organized with a specific purpose and was, on some level below the cellular, still organized for that purpose. Her first pass went wrong, the blade skipping sideways along a membrane she hadn't anticipated. She reset. Second attempt, wrong angle, the cut going shallow and veering. Third, she adjusted the grip. Applied the force from higher in the shoulder. Dropped her center of gravity the way she had watched him do it. And the cut began to move the way it was supposed to move. 4 minutes for the first piece. When it separated and landed on the wooden table, with a sound she would hear in her memory for a considerable time afterward, she was breathing through her mouth, and her shoulders were introducing themselves to muscles she had not previously been aware of owning. She plunged both hands into the salt bucket. The salt was coarse and gray, and when it contacted the scraped skin of her palms, she closed her hands around it and pressed her back teeth together and forced her hands to keep moving, pressing the crystals into every surface of the meat, working them into the grain, because this was not decorative salting. And the stakes of doing it inadequately were not abstract. If you miss a spot, he had said during the single demonstration, the rot starts there. The rot spreads. You find out in February when you open the storage and there's nothing left. She did not miss a spot. Mrs. Cole worked the other elk at a pace that made her efforts look like what they were, which was a learning exercise carried out by someone learning at the outer edge of their current capacity. And he made no comment about her pace or her technique or anything at all. He was simply working, and she was simply working beside him. And the only sounds were the wet compression of meat, the heavy scrape of rock salt, and their respective breath in the cold white air. She found a rhythm, not his rhythm. She was not there yet and would not be for weeks. But her own rhythm, the beat of someone who has understood what a task requires and is applying herself to it without drama. And underneath that rhythm, running quietly like a secondary instrument, her father's voice, the Saturday morning version. The one that worked through problems with the steady confidence of someone who believed any problem, understood clearly enough, had a manageable shape. This is where you are. This is what you have. This is what the next 10 minutes requires. At some point, Cole straightened from the carcass and looked at her work. A long moment, and then, good one word. No inflection, no elaboration. She understood in that moment what the word was worth, coming from this particular person. And she stored it carefully in the column where she kept the things that turned out to be accurate and reliable, which was, she was beginning to understand, the only column that mattered out here. The days that followed built on that morning the way a structure builds on a foundation, each new thing resting on the thing that came before it. She learned the difference between snow that would pack under a boot sole and snow that wouldn't, which was information about whether a crust would hold her weight on the north-facing slope when she went to collect water from the creek below the tree line. She learned that yellow in the western sky at afternoon meant lethal wind by evening, and that a specific bronze cast in the southwest meant 3 days of clear. She learned to read the fire level not by looking at it, but by the quality of heat on her face from across the room, which was faster, and left her hands free for other work. Cole left before first light and returned when the light was going. His returns followed a pattern she had mapped by the end of the first week. Rifle on the peg by the door. Check the water bucket. Check the stove level. Then one look at her, brief, comprehensive. Not concern, exactly. The systematic check of a man confirming that all the variables in his environment are running as expected before he allows himself to stop moving for the day. She had decided early to find this neither alarming nor flattering but simply accurate, which was the only useful frame for it. By the end of the first week she had also decided something else. She had decided that the books on the shelf were not decoration and were not accident. A man who read Thoreau's series, who had cracked the spine of the Whitman through repeated use, who had Melville in a place he could reach from the bed, that man was not the sum of his coat and his silence and his trapline. She had been trained by 31 years of watching Henry Ashford that the information you needed was usually in what people hadn't thought to hide. And what Cole Maddox had not thought to hide was 20 books on a rough-hewn shelf in a 12-by-16 cabin at 9,000 feet, and she was still working out what that information was about. Day 11. She was sweeping the floor, a task she had taken on without discussion because the packed earth accumulated debris in ways that compounded the already limited space. And because there was a particular satisfaction in bringing order to a space that was otherwise indifferent to orderliness. The journal was on the lower shelf, horizontal, tucked behind the vertical row of books along the wall. The spine cracked in the pattern of something that had been opened repeatedly and then stopped being opened. Not worn from continuous use, but worn from a specific period of use that had ended at a specific point in time. She picked it up because she thought it was a field guide she hadn't noticed, opened the cover. Inside the front, in a handwriting that was not Cole's, lighter, rounder. The hand of someone with a different temperament and a different way of moving through the world, Della Maddox. And a date beginning the first entry. April 14, 1878. She turned to the last page. March 8, 1880. The final entry ended mid-sentence, not at the end of a paragraph, not at the end of a thought. Mid-sentence, as though the pen had been set down for a moment to be picked up and finished and the moment had never ended. Ruth stood with the journal open for 4 seconds. Then she placed it back exactly as she had found it. Same position, same horizontal orientation, same relationship to the almanac beside it. Continued sweeping, but the arithmetic would not leave her alone. 1880. The journal ending in March, and the piece of yellow floral fabric on Cole's right wrist that she had seen on the slope that first night and had been seeing every day since. Washed when he washed his hands, retied when he dried them. The motion of it so habitual it had stopped being a decision. She had suspected what it meant. She had not confirmed it. And now she had confirmed it in the way you confirm a thing you already knew by finding the evidence you had been waiting to find. And the confirmation settled into her chest not as surprise, but as the particular weight of something half understood finally becoming whole. She went back to sweeping. She had been giving him the space of not asking. She would keep giving him that space. But she understood now what she was holding the space for, and the understanding changed the texture of the room around her in ways she could not entirely account for. Changed what she heard in the sound of his boots on the packed earth at the end of each day. Not heavier, more defined. Day 14 arrived in the form of a needle, evening. Wind finding the gaps in the north wall, chinking them. Cole cleaning the rifle by the stove, the methodical sound of the cleaning rod through the barrel, a rhythm as familiar to her now as the sound of the fire. She was at the table with heavy thread and the second shirt in the mending pile, working on a torn sleeve seam. The needle was old and not quite right for the flannel's weight, and the combination required more force than finesse. The needle slipped through the fabric and directly into the pad of her left thumb at the base of the nail, deep. The blood followed the withdrawal with conviction. She pulled it out and put her thumb in her mouth and looked at the lamp and waited, and the word that came out before she could close the door on it was not a word she had ever used in the parlor on Hanover Street. The sound of the cleaning rod stopped. 4 seconds of silence. Then Cole's boots on the packed earth, not toward her but toward the upper cabinet, the shelf where he kept the small medical supplies in their particular arrangement. His boots again. And a small glass vial appeared on the table in front of her, placed there by a hand that withdrew immediately. Pine pitch and yarrow, not looking at her, back already turning. On the puncture site, it burns for approximately 30 seconds and then goes numb. If it gets infected, you lose grip strength. Without grip strength, you can't manage the skinning knife. Without the skinning knife, the arrangement we have becomes impractical. She looked at the vial, Same framing as the first night with the bear fat. Practical consequence as the stated rationale for care. But this time she noticed something else. He had explained the vial's contents without being asked. On the first night he had set the tin down and named it and walked away. Tonight he had named it and explained the purpose of each component, which was one sentence more than his usual. And she had been cataloging the small measurements of this man for 2 weeks, with the same attentiveness she brought to the fire level, and the ice thickness and the slope of the morning light, and she did not miss the difference. She uncorked the vial and applied the medicine. He had not misrepresented the burn. It arrived with considerable conviction, and she breathed through it with her eyes closed, counting seconds until the numbness replaced it. She opened her eyes. He was back at the rifle, his back at an angle. Not the full rotation away he had maintained in the first days, but somewhere between that and facing her. A few degrees of difference that she would not have been able to measure in week 1 and now registered clearly. "Thank you," she said. 2 seconds. Then, without turning, "Don't bleed on the shirt. That's a week's work in the wool." And Ruth Ashford laughed. Not a managed social laugh. Not the kind she had produced in the parlor on Hanover Street to navigate silences that needed navigating. A genuine laugh. Brief and involuntary. The kind that arrives when the distance between the world you were living in 3 weeks ago and the world you are living in now becomes briefly visible from a particular angle. And the visibility produces something her body translated without consulting her as absurd. The hairpin and the mountain lion and the bear fat and the needle and the elk and the cracked boot heel and the mending pile and 14 days. All of it lined up for a moment in a way that was either extraordinary or absurd, and she genuinely could not determine which, and her body resolved the ambiguity the only way available to it. Cole did not turn around. But she had been watching the angle of his back for 2 weeks, and she noted with the same quiet precision with which she noted the frost thickness and the fire level that the set of his shoulders shifted very slightly in a direction that was not quite nothing. The geography of a face and body slowly relearning what certain configurations feel like. She picked up the needle and went back to the work. The blizzard announced itself 2 mornings later through pressure. Ruth felt it first as a change in the air inside the cabin, subtle, the kind of atmospheric shift that log structures with clay and moss chinking transmit directly into the interior rather than absorbing. Her ears registered it before she was fully awake. Then she was sitting up. Because the quality of the silence outside was wrong in the specific way that silences are wrong when they are collecting themselves before becoming something loud. Cole was already at the window. The shutter opened 2 fingers width. Reading the sky the way she had watched him read every other system he monitored. As a grammar he had spent years learning to speak. He latched it shut. Blizzard. The word carried no drama, only category and urgency. Not a regular snow event. We have 90 minutes, possibly less. Ruth was already standing, already thinking about what 90 minutes meant in terms of what it required. The wood pile. All of it. We can move it. I need the animals secured and the lower cache provisions brought up. You're on wood. They moved, not rushed, purposeful. Which is the difference between panic getting into the planning and understanding the situation and knowing what to prioritize first. She was outside with the woodpile tarp pulled clear before she had consciously decided to do it, working the frozen knot in the binding rope with fingers that began to numb immediately in the outside air. Loading her arms to the structural limit and carrying the first stack around to the door. Then again. On the 4th trip the outside air had changed sharp. The pressure against her face increasing, and there was a smell underneath the pine that had not been there an hour ago, something that had traveled a considerable distance and had not yet finished arriving. On the 5th trip she saw it coming over the northern ridge. Not a cloud formation, not weather in any meteorological sense she had a category for, a wall. An actual wall of gray-white moving down the mountain at a speed that stopped her walking for 3 full seconds before she forced herself to move faster. She got the last load inside, and Cole pulled the door shut behind her, and they had 30 seconds of stillness before the blizzard arrived. Not a gust, an impact, sustained and continuous and immediate, the kind of force that doesn't arrive and leave but arrives and inhabits them. The logs groaned, the sound moving through the floor into her feet and up through her knees, which was a different and more comprehensive experience of a building than she had ever had before. The chinking on the north wall whistled in 3 places at once. The lamp flame went horizontal and very nearly went out before finding a new equilibrium, and then the door, it opened inward. The wind outside was creating a pressure differential that worked against that geometry, pulling, creating a sustained negative pressure that the leather hinges were not engineered for. Cole had the iron crossbar in both hands and his boots flat on the packed earth, leaning back with his full weight. And even him, even that enormous frame with all of it committed, the door was losing. Not quickly, but losing. She crossed the room in 3 steps and hit the door with both palms flat, planted her feet the way she had planted them on the railroad embankment when she decided she was going to stand up instead of staying down. Heels into the earth, weight forward. The whole of herself committed to the single objective. The wood was freezing under her hands, a skim of ice already forming on the interior face from the air driving through the narrowing gap, and her boot soles slipped once before they found purchase. When I say 3, Cole said. His voice strained at the edges in a way she had not heard before. The voice of someone managing significant exertion. Never panic, but the edges of maximum effort. Ready. 1. She felt his weight redistribute through the door, felt the adjustment in how the force was being applied. She shifted her own angle to complement rather than duplicate. 2. The wind surged. A single massive concentrated push that drove the door inward 2 full inches before their combined resistance could catch it. Her left shoulder hit the wood hard and the joint sent a bolt of direct specific pain through the arm that came very close to making the decision for her. Very close. 3. They shoved together. Her pushing high on the door where the geometry of her position and his created the most efficient combined force. And the door moved inch by inch. Fighting the gale. Each inch requiring more than the last. Until the frame hit the stop with a solid impact she felt in her back teeth. The bar, Cole said. Still holding. His shoulder against the door. Boots fighting the floor. She dropped to her knees. The iron crossbar was on the floor, not in its brackets where it lived. On the floor, knocked loose in the initial chaos before she had arrived, her fingers found it. Both hands lifted it. She fumbled the first placement. The bracket on the left. Wrong angle. The door moved a 1/4 inch as Cole's boot slipped. She adjusted. Placed it. Felt it seat into both brackets, shoved it down. The wind became sound in the walls rather than presence in the room. Cole slid down the door and sat on the floor. His chest moving with the controlled, deliberate breathing of someone managing the physiology of significant exertion. Snow crusted in his dark beard was melting into his collar. He sat with his back against the door and his forearms on his knees and said nothing for a long time, looking at nothing visible, just breathing. Ruth slumped against the wall to his left. Her shoulder was registering information she was going to have to address. Her hands were running through a fine, rapid tremor that was adrenaline metabolizing and not cold. And she had learned to tell the difference, and she waited for it to work through. In the stove light, the lamp having finally given up entirely, his face was different than she'd seen it before. The particular blankness it wore most of the time was gone, stripped by whatever the mountain had just reminded him of. He looked like someone who had been shown, against his preference, something true about the ratio between what he was and what this landscape was. He looked like someone for whom outcomes were not guaranteed. Someone who had needed help with the door and had gotten it. "You didn't freeze?" he said. Quiet enough that the blizzard outside nearly covered it. She held his gaze across the small span of floor between them. "No, you didn't either." He looked at her for 3 full seconds, which was long for him. Then he pushed himself up off the floor and went to the stove and added 2 heavy logs to the coals. The fire caught. The dancing light shifted the shadows on the soot-black walls. And he went to work with the ordinary sounds of the room, and the extraordinary sound of the blizzard doing what blizzards do. And Ruth stayed where she was against the wall and let her hands finish their trembling and thought, for the first time, not about what she was surviving but about what she was building, and found she did not have a name for it yet but was not troubled by that. Some things arrive before their names do. The second day of the blizzard, her shoulder announced it had been patient long enough. The muscle pull from the door, compounding the old bruising from the embankment, had stiffened overnight into something that made full range of motion and intention rather than a capability. She had been managing this information without sharing it, because it had no actionable component she could identify. She could work with it or she could not work. She was going to work. What she had not been managing as successfully as she believed was the fever. It arrived the way fevers arrive when they have been building longer than you noticed. Not as a new development, but as the revelation of a process already underway. The light in the room went wrong first, too bright at the edges, shadows slightly unmoored from the objects casting them. Then her joints reported in with a deep ache different from the muscle ache of physical exertion. deeper and less specific and more insistent. Then her skin, which felt too close to the surface, as though some insulation between herself and the air around her had been quietly removed. She was sitting at the table with the mending pile when Cole crossed the room without preamble and put the back of his hand against her neck just below the jaw. His skin was cold from the unheated far corner of the cabin. Or she was hot. Both probably. But the contrast was startling enough that she pulled back on instinct. His hand dropped. "Sit down, I am sitting, then stay sitting. You're running a fever. The shoulder injury is compounding something from the exposure. Your body is directing resources to the inflammation and running short on what's left for temperature regulation." He was already at the upper cabinet, the cloth bundle of dried medicinals in his hands. This is not a request. She thought about arguing. Then she thought about the alternative, which was arguing and then having the fever make the argument for him 2 hours from now in a more comprehensive fashion. And that would be worse in every dimension. She stayed sitting. He came back with a ceramic mug and prepared the tea at the table with the same precision he brought to everything. Dried willow bark in the right proportion. Elderberry from a small separate pouch. Water from the pot kept warm at the stove's edge. He set the mug in front of her. Willow bark for the fever and the shoulder inflammation. Elderberry because it shortens the duration of what you're dealing with. She looked at the mug, then at him. On the first night he had set the tin down and named it and walked away. In the elk shed he had demonstrated and stepped back. Tonight he was explaining the components, explaining the reasoning behind each one, which was a degree of elaboration he did not produce unless something had shifted in how he was calculating the exchange between them. She filed this without remarking on it and picked up the mug. The tea tasted like something retrieved from the bottom of a creek bed in late August, and she drank it in 3 extended swallows without making a sound about the taste. Because the taste was irrelevant, and she was not developing the habit of making sounds about irrelevant things at 9,000 feet. He watched her finish it. Something in the watching registered what it saw and adjusted. The same faculty she had observed in the way he read the fire level applied now to her, with the same unhurried accuracy. The fever took the second day and made it both longer and shorter than the first. Longer because time stretches when the body is running its own internal argument. Shorter because she was moving in and out of full consciousness without it quite being sleep. She lay on the wool blanket near the stove, and the cabin walls occasionally felt closer than they were. And she surfaced once and heard the sound of sleet against the logs and did not know what hour it was, and went back under. She surfaced properly sometime in the second night. The fire had burned down to coals, the orange glow reduced to a pulse in the dark. She was cold in the way that happens when a fever breaks and takes the false warmth with it, leaving the actual temperature of the room to introduce itself without ceremony. She registered, in the moment before she was fully conscious, that there was weight on top of her, not the wool blanket, something heavier, something that smelled strongly of pine sap and cured hide, his coat, off his body and laid over her while she slept. She was awake enough to understand what that meant in terms of the temperature of the far end of the room where he had been sitting, and what it meant in terms of the decision behind it, and she filed both carefully and lay still. A moment later she became aware that he was sitting beside her, not in the chair. On the floor, his back against the table leg, arms crossed over his chest, not asleep. His eyes were open and fixed on the coals. The piece of yellow floral fabric on his wrist was visible in the dim red light between his sleeve and his folded hands. She didn't know how to ask what she wanted to ask. She had been waiting for conditions she couldn't quite define. But waiting was beginning to feel less like patience and more like avoidance, and she had not survived the last 2 weeks by confusing those two things. She asked the part closest to language, why her voice came out rough, barely more than breath. The coat, the tea, being awake. He didn't ask what she meant, he understood what she meant. The coals shifted in the stove, a settling sound, one piece of wood finding its final position against another. The blizzard maintained its commentary outside, uninterested in whatever was happening in the room. Because out here, he said, and his voice was low enough that the sound of the fire nearly covered it. The worst thing isn't starving. He was looking at the coals when he said it, not at her. And she was looking at the side of his face in the dim red light, the deep lines around his eyes, the jaw set in its habitual position, the piece of yellow fabric visible at his wrist. And she understood that the silence he was talking about was not the absence of sound. She did not ask about Della, not yet. The shape of the question had become less like a gap in information she was trying to fill, and more like a door she now understood was there and real. and which she would wait to open until the conditions were right for opening it without breaking what was on the other side. She closed her eyes. He stayed where he was. The fire in the stove pulsed red in the dark. The blizzard hammered the logs. And Ruth Ashford lay under a man's coat on the floor of a cabin on a Colorado mountain and slept for the first time in a long time without dreaming about Crane's office or the brown paper or the men carrying her father's writing desk out the door into the October light. The blizzard broke on the morning of the third day into a silence so complete it had physical weight. She woke to it and lay still for a moment, listening to the specific absence of sound that happens when sustained noise stops. And the world hasn't yet decided what to replace it with. The fever was gone. The shoulder had settled from acute to something she could work around. She was genuinely and specifically hungry in the way that follows illness, the body demanding replacement of what it had spent. Cole was already at the window, the shutter opened fully, daylight flooding the room in the violent, flawless white of post-blizzard Colorado sunlight. He drove the iron shovel into the wall of packed snow filling the window frame, cleared an exit, and climbed out to dig the door from the exterior. Ruth took the fire iron and swept the snow he'd shoveled inward away from his working area, pushing it toward the center of the room to give him clear footing. He paused once, looking down at the cleared path she was making. Did not comment, kept digging them. When the door finally opened and the full morning came in, a 6-foot drift cut through to the threshold, the world beyond it transformed into an unbroken white ocean under an aggressive and flawless blue sky. Cole stood at the end of the trench he'd cut and looked out at the valley below for a long time. Then he turned and looked at her standing on the threshold, and his breath made shapes in the cold air. "You didn't break," he said, the same tone he used for everything. But she had been in this space with him long enough to know that the tone was not the measure of the weight behind it. "I couldn't afford to," she said. "I owed you labor." At the corners of his eyes something moved. Not a smile, not near enough for that, but the territory adjacent to one, the landscape of a face slowly relearning what certain expressions feel like after a long time without them. He turned back toward the tree line, shovel over one shoulder. "Get the fire going. I'm checking whether the storm killed the traps." She turned back into the cabin and found the kindling and knelt at the stove and built the fire from the beginning, and her hands knew what they were doing without her telling them. And she noticed this in the specific way. She noticed things that had changed without her consciously directing the change. 4 months after that morning, she marked them by the slowly accumulating index of things she could do without thinking about doing them, which expanded week by week until the thinking and the doing had merged into something that was simply her moving through her days. The trap lines changing productivity as the season deepened, the beaver on the lower drainage running strong through December and thinning in February, when the ice thickened over the best pools, the quality of the morning light shifting weekly in small increments towards something with more gold in it as January became February, became the first tentative edges of March. In late January, she was stitching a torn seam in Cole's work shirt while he was wearing it, because changing into something else was not practical that afternoon, and the work required her to lean close to the fabric stretched across his ribs, which was when she saw it. A long pale scar running from his left collarbone to the bottom of his rib cage, visible through the worn flannel where the fabric had thinned from years of use. She did not ask about it. He did not explain it. She cut the thread and moved away, and put the information in the column with the other things she was waiting to understand, and went back to the work. What Cole learned during those 4 months she observed rather than was told. He learned to sleep in the cabin when she was still awake, not immediately, but by the 3rd week. A change from the first 2 weeks, during which he had not allowed himself to be unconscious when she was conscious. A vigilance she had initially attributed to distrust, and then revised to something else when she noticed it was not watchfulness, so much as the inability to stop monitoring a system when you have been the only variable in it for long enough that adding a second variable requires a complete recalibration of what safe feels like. He learned that she did not need to be told when something needed doing if she could see that it needed doing. And she had the impression, from certain small adjustments in how he allocated his attention during the day, that he had started accounting for her presence without deciding to, the way you start accounting for anything that is reliably there. On an evening in late February, he came back from the line, and she had reorganized the storage based on a system that prioritized the highest rotation items at accessible height. He stood in the storage area looking at it. The bean sacks should stay where they were. The canvas gets damp in that corner when the melt starts. She had not known about the corner dampness. Which is the dry corner? The one you moved the bean sacks from. She moved them back. He went inside. That was the whole of it. But she noticed over the following days that he had shifted the salt storage to the right side of the new configuration, without commenting on it, which meant he had accepted the rest of the reorganization, without needing to establish that he had accepted it, which was, in its way, the most significant communication they'd had since the blizzard. And then Walt Pickett arrived with the spring supply run and the mail, and everything changed shape again. He came up the trail on his mule in early April with the cheerful persistence of a man who has been making the same supply run for 9 years and considers the consistency itself a form of accomplishment. He had a buffalo coat and a mule loaded with supply sacks and the expression of a man arriving at something considerably better than what he expected to find. Well, Walt said, pushing his hat back and looking at Ruth with the specific delight of someone encountering a situation that is going to provide supper conversation for months. Cole Maddox took himself a wife.
I'm Ruth Ashford. I work here.
Walt looked at her, looked at the cabin, looked at the bone scraper in her hand, and looked back at her with the assessment of a man who has spent decades reading situations across a trade counter and is choosing, out of what appeared to be social grace, not to deploy that assessment at full capacity. Sure you do, he said, and began unstrapping the supply sacks from the mule with the serene equanimity of someone who has decided not to argue with the official version of events. Cole appeared from the north side, trapline angle. He took in the situation at the clearing's edge with one comprehensive look, and walked toward them with his usual economy. And Ruth noticed the slight settling of his posture that she had come to read as the specific adjustment of someone who has arranged his existence to minimize the number of people in it, and is managing an unavoidable exception by deliberate composure. Walt handed over the mail bundle with the casualness of someone delivering flour and coffee and gunpowder. Cole went through it quickly, sorting by category, the practiced speed of someone who has been doing this for years and has a system. And then he stopped. She was 12 feet away, and she saw the stop, the slight change in how his hand held the bundle. 2 full seconds of stillness over one item, the kind of stillness that in Cole Maddox indicated significant internal processing rather than the absence of it. He looked up and found her across the clearing. He walked to the work table, not to her, to the table, and set the item down in front of her position without a word, and continued toward the supply sacks to help Walt. She looked at it. The envelope was from Whitfield & Sons, Boston. Her name on the front in a clerk's careful hand. Paper thick and cream-colored. The kind that commercial legal firms use to communicate that what was inside warranted the quality of what contained it. She picked it up, pressed her thumb against the sealed edge, did not open it, put it in her coat pocket. Walt was talking, which was his natural state. She caught the edges of what he was saying. Price of Spring's beef, condition of the road south, something about the new territorial marshal in Black Ridge. And then, with the complete casualness of someone passing along a piece of news he had not yet calibrated for relevance, heard from the telegraph man in Black Ridge, there's been some legal interest out of Denver in an estate matter. Name out of Boston. Ashford, I think it was. Something about a debt collection dispute and a counterclaim. Got people in Denver fairly engaged, apparently. She looked at the outline of the envelope through the canvas of her coat pocket. Cole had heard it. She knew because she had been watching Cole Maddox move through space for 5 months. And she registered the fraction of a pause in his movement with the supply sacks. A pause so small Walt didn't catch it, but she did. Later, when Walt had settled onto the upturned crate that served as outdoor seating and was deep in a detailed account of a dispute at a Junction trading post in March, Cole found a moment beside her at the work table, not close, looking at the middle distance beyond the lean-to. You should open it, I know. Knowing what it says doesn't change what it says. I know that too. A pause in which she looked at the lean-to where the elk had hung and were now gone, their contribution to the winter thoroughly realized. My father built something from nothing. I watched him do it for 30 years. The people who took it didn't deserve it and the law gave it to them anyway. She put her hand flat on the table. That's the whole of it. Not quite the whole of it. She looked at him. The whole of it would include what you do next. Which is not the same question as what was done to you. She held that for a moment. It was the most sentences he had produced in sequence on a topic unrelated to operational logistics since she had arrived, and the content of them was something she did not have an immediate word for. She put it in the column with the other things she was waiting to understand. Walt surfaced from his trading post account and looked over at them. Heading back to Black Ridge in the morning. Be there 3 or 4 days before I go east on the Gunnison route. If anyone was of a mind to make the trip down, the timing would work out fine. Said with no particular emphasis. The way someone says something they say every time, not expecting it to land differently today, saying it anyway because the offering is its own complete action. The offer settled in the clearing. Cole did not look at her, which was, she had come to understand, significant rather than dismissive. He was not looking at her because looking at her would be a form of deciding for her, and he did not do that. He understood from the railroad tracks that she was a person who made her own decisions, and he had not revised that understanding once in 5 months. She looked at Walt, at his mule, a gray animal with the level, comprehensive gaze of something that has transported a great many things a great many miles and arrived at complete neutrality about the specifics. She looked at the cabin, the sod roof with its first small patches of melt at the south-facing edge, the window with the repaired shutter she had worked on in February. Then she put her hand in her pocket and her fingers found the envelope. "I need to send a letter from Black Ridge," she said. "Before we go." The word landed in the air between them. Cole looked at her then, direct, the full attention he usually rationed carefully. Something in it working through the implications of that particular word choice, with the thoroughness he brought to all information that mattered. "I need to buy rope," he said. "Current stock is insufficient for the summer work." She waited. "And there's a mule shoe situation I need to discuss with the Black Ridge farrier." She waited more. "Road south will be passable in 3 days. We leave at first light on the 4th. Walt looked between them with the expression of a man witnessing something he was going to describe in considerable detail to every person he encountered between here and the Gunnison route, and turned back to his mule with the satisfied air of someone who came looking for nothing specific and found exactly what he was looking for. Ruth took the envelope out of her pocket. She looked at her name on the front in the clerk's careful hand. Then she opened it, standing at the work table in the April light, and read what it said. 2 sheets. She read both, folded them along their original creases, and put them back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her pocket, and picked up the bone scraper, and went back to the pelt she had been working on when Walt arrived, because the pelt still needed finishing before the sun dropped, and her hands on the scraper were different than they had been an hour ago. Steadier, the kind of steady that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of a decision, from knowing finally what came next. The 2 sheets of paper from Boston had told her 2 things pointing in opposite directions, which was exactly how Silas Crane operated. The first sheet, from Whitfield and Sons, was 4 paragraphs of carefully constructed prose, informing her that the estate of Henry Ashford had been fully liquidated, the debt satisfied in accordance with the terms of the original loan instrument, and that Ruth Ashford was accordingly released from any remaining financial obligation and free to pursue whatever future she chose. The language of release was particularly careful, a door being closed and locked from the outside while describing itself as standing open. The second sheet was different paper, different hand, not a clerk's neutral script, but the writing of someone who chose words the way careful people choose tools, for fitness to purpose rather than appearance. The name at the bottom, Owen Bassett, Attorney, Denver. He wrote that a witness had come forward with testimony regarding the original Ashford loan documentation, specifically regarding irregularities in the execution of certain clauses that appeared to have been added after the instrument's primary signing. He wrote that if she wished to contest the resolution of the estate on grounds of procedural fraud, a window existed under the applicable statutes, and he would be available to assist. The window was 90 days from the date of his letter. His letter was dated 4 months ago. The 90-day window had closed 30 days before she received it. She had done this arithmetic standing at the work table with the bone scraper in her free hand, and April light coming in low and gold across the clearing, and she had concluded one thing with absolute clarity. Lawyers who had only one mechanisms available did not write letters describing it after it expired. They wrote letters explaining that nothing further could be done. This was a different letter, which meant there was something else, which meant Denver. 3 days later, the road south was passable in the way that mountain roads in April are passable, theoretically, with commitment, and with the understanding that passable and comfortable were not synonyms and never would be in Colorado Spring. Cole rode first on his working horse and she followed on the brown mare, whose name she did not know because Cole had never assigned one, and who looked at her with the evaluative patience of an animal that has been around long enough to form opinions and shares them on its own schedule. Walt had ridden ahead, talking back over his shoulder about the trail conditions with the sustained enthusiasm of a man who has been alone on a supply route for 2 weeks and has accumulated a significant backlog of things to say. The first hour through the dense timber above the clearing was narrow going, the trail buried in places under a remaining foot of compacted snow that had to be navigated by feel as much as sight. Below the timber, the trail opened into the broader switchbacks descending the lower mountain. And here the snow was thin and the mud was serious, the specific deep mud of Mountain Spring that has been accumulating depth since November and has no intention of resolving quickly. In the gaps Walt's conversation left, which were not large but were sufficient, Ruth told Cole more about her father than she had told him before. Not the account book version she had delivered to Crane across the State Street desk, the actual version. Henry Ashford at the shop counter on Saturday mornings when she was 8 years old, sitting at the edge of his working table, while he went through the week's accounts and thought out loud, not performing the thinking for her but simply doing it in her presence and allowing her to absorb whatever she could, the way he had said, when she found the first significant error in a supplier's invoice at 14, that she would be useful to someone someday, and that was better than being decorative, and she should not let anyone convince her otherwise. The way he had looked at her when he said it. Not with pride exactly. With the specific satisfaction of someone watching something grow in the direction it was always going to grow and is pleased to have the evidence confirmed. She told Cole about the Connecticut River Valley painting. The summer her father had never explained and which she had never asked about, because some silences between fathers and daughters carry weight that asking would dissolve them. And she told him that from the distance of 5 months on a Colorado mountain, she understood that silence differently now, as the space around something formative that had happened to her father before he became the version of himself she knew. The same way the space around certain things in a 12-by-16 cabin told you something about the version of a man that existed before the version she had ridden down this mountain beside. Cole listened without interrupting them. Not the social performance of someone waiting for his turn. Actually listening, the full attention of a man who has spent years alone and made his peace with giving whatever is in front of him his complete and unhurried regard. When she finished, he was quiet for a length of trail. Then, he taught you how to read a room before you read a contract. He taught me they were the same thing. Both tell you what someone wants you to see. The information you need is usually in what they didn't think to hide them. Cole rode beside her for a moment without speaking, but she had been in his company long enough to read his silences. And this one had the quality of something received accurately, and she let it be what it was. He told her a little about Della in the broader stretches where the descent allowed conversation to carry them. Not everything. She had not expected everything and would not have wanted it, because some things belong entirely to the person they happen to, and being trusted with a portion requires understanding that the portion is not the whole, and the whole is not owed. He told her that Della had come from Tennessee with her family when she was 19 and had stayed when the family continued west. Because she had looked at this landscape and made a decision about it, with the finality of someone who has learned to trust her own assessments without requiring external confirmation. He said this with the register he used for decisions made without hesitation, the same register she had heard him use when evaluating a well-constructed trap mechanism or a correctly fitted timber joint. She would have said the angle on your hide scraping was wrong. He offered somewhere on the lower switchbacks, not preceded by anything, just released into the air between them. The angle isn't wrong, different method, more pressure toward the tail end, less at the head. I'd want to see the results before I concede the method. 1/2 mile passed beneath the horse's feet, mud heavy and slow. She would have liked that answer, he said. Ruth looked at the trail and said nothing, and let the words be what they were, which was the most honest thing she could do with them. Black Ridge arrived in the early afternoon, materializing from a suggestion in the valley below into a specific collection of buildings arranged along a main street of serious mud. Mountains rising on 3 sides and a creek running along the eastern edge at its maximum spring enthusiasm. 400 people, Walt had said. It looked like a place that had grown according to need rather than plan, each building placed where it was most useful at the time of its construction, with no particular conversation between structures about aesthetic coherence. She found it immediately more interesting than any planned space she had been in. People noticed them arriving, not dramatically, because that would have violated the particular social contract of a community where everyone already knew everyone, and performed that knowledge through studied casualness rather than open acknowledgement. But awareness moved through the main street ahead of them like a current just beneath the surface. The slight pause before a task resumed. The person who found a reason to be near the general store's porch. Two men at the farrier's door who looked up and then looked at each other with the compressed communication of people who have been sharing an information system long enough that words are redundant. Cole Maddox, back in Black Ridge. 4 years gone and now here. Broad enough in the shoulders that he blocked the afternoon light when he turned sideways between buildings. Tall enough that Agnes who was not a small woman, looked up when she spoke to him the way people look up at something that has redefined their working assumption about height. With a woman, Agnes came out of the general store before they had finished tying the horses. She was in her 60s and moved with the authority of someone who had been the operational center of a particular square footage for long enough that the square footage had organized itself around her preferences. White hair pulled back with functional severity. A face that had stopped producing expressions it didn't mean sometime in the previous decade, which had the effect of making the expressions it did mean carry considerably more weight. She looked at Ruth with the complete, unhurried attention of a person who knows that first impressions formed in haste are wrong more often than right. She looked at the hands, then the posture, then the eyes. Where are you from, Boston? And where are you now? Ruth held the question for the length of time it deserved. On a mountain above your town, temporarily in your town. Something in Agnes's assessment shifted, not toward warmth exactly, toward interest, which in this particular face carried more meaning than warmth would have. Come inside. I have coffee that doesn't taste like snowmelt, which I suspect may be a change of pace, said without looking at Cole, which was the most inclusive thing she could have done, because it presupposed that Ruth made her own decisions about where she went, which was correct, and which not everyone on that street appeared prepared to presuppose based on the expressions she was reading on the porch. Inside the general store, the layered smell of dried goods and years of supply runs and cedar shelving and the particular history of a community's needs accumulated in one space over a long time. Agnes poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping itself ready on the back stove and set it in front of Ruth on the counter, and looked at her with the patient attention of someone who has decided to form an accurate opinion rather than a quick one. Cole Maddox hasn't come down this mountain in 4 years, Agnes said, observational, the tone of someone who collects facts because facts are what you build understanding from. I know. He came down for rope. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. He has rope. Bought 3 coils from me in October. A pause. Then something moved at the corners of Agnes's mouth. The movement of a face deciding the person in front of it is worth the investment of genuine response. She refilled the cup Ruth had already emptied. Went to attend to another customer at the far end of the counter without saying anything further, and left Ruth to the coffee and the space to think, which was either hospitality or an act of considerable intelligence and was probably both. Ruth wrote the letter to Bassett at the post office table. 3 drafts on scrap paper before she committed to the version she would send. Direct and specific in the way Henry Ashford had taught her, not performing brevity and not performing elaboration, saying what needed saying in the order that made the logic clearest. She told Bassett she was alive and had received his letter, though the window he mentioned had closed before it reached her. She understood this closed one specific avenue. She believed other avenues existed and wanted to discuss them. She could be in Denver within 2 weeks if a meeting was practical. In the last paragraph, which she wrote last because it required the most precision, she said, her father had built 31 years of honest work, and the record of what happened to it was currently wrong, and she intended to correct it through whatever legal mechanisms remained available. Not because the money could be recovered, because records were records and Henry Ashford deserved to have his corrected. She read this paragraph twice. It said exactly what she meant. She sealed it and paid for the postage and handed it across the counter and walked back out onto the muddy main street and felt, in her chest, the specific lightness that follows committing to something you have been deciding to commit to for a long time. Cole was at the farrier as promised, visible through the open door of the smithy, standing with the particular stillness of a man whose size makes every room rearrange itself around him, whether he intends it or not. The apprentice beside him reached approximately to his shoulder. Cole was looking at something the apprentice had shown him, nodding once in the decisive way that indicated he had evaluated the information and found it sufficient. She watched him from the street for a moment and thought about what it cost him to be here. She had thought about the rope excuse, which was transparently a reason, and both of them knew it. But she had not thought specifically about the cost, about what it required of a man who had arranged his entire existence around the avoidance of a particular kind of exposure. To arrange it differently because someone had used a word without thinking, and he had heard it and acted on it, and she had not said it accidentally. Supper that night at the establishment that served as Black Ridge's community dining room, a long table at the back of what was technically a saloon, but operated 3 evenings a week on a different set of social conventions, with Agnes Pruitt's auxiliary kitchen providing the food and an implicit agreement keeping the evening functional. 22 people at the table. She counted them as she counted everything, by habit rather than intention. She and Cole on the same side, Walt having arranged this with the cheerful domestic efficiency of a man who has decided to be helpful in ways not quite asked for but not quite unwanted either. Walt across from them, already deep in conversation about a cattle matter generating opinion for 2 seasons. Agnes at the far end. Marshal Ned Carver, 2 seats down from Cole, a lean man in his 40s with the watchful economy of someone who has learned that most situations resolve themselves if you observe them long enough before acting. And at the far end of the table, a man she had not seen before. Mid-40s, a suit too new and too city for Black Ridge. Sitting with the composed attention of someone here on specific business who knew exactly what it was. He had looked at her when she came in, and the look had the quality of recognition before introduction, which meant he had known her name before she walked through the door, which meant Crane had sent him. The thought arrived cold and specific. She filed it and kept her expression even and ate and listened and waited to see what shape the evening took. Walt was constitutionally incapable of having information worth sharing and not sharing it, not malice, nature. And she had known this about him since the clearing and had not found a way to address it before supper. So he told the story. The train, the tracks, the mountain in November, the winter, her name, And then because the legal situation connected to the name and he had no internal system for sorting which connections should stay private, he told that too. Whitfield and Sons, Boston, the debt, the estate, 22 people and the table going quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when one narrative has finished and another has arrived. She looked at her plate, expressions around the table, curiosity, straightforward and not unkind. Calculation, the mental arithmetic of people adding new information to their model of someone who had just entered their community. And at the far end, the man in the new suit, watching her with the composed readiness of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has prepared for it. She had not walked 3s on railroad ballast in November, butchered 2 elk, survived a 4-day blizzard, and ridden 2 days down a mountain to let someone else's version of her story stand unchallenged in a room she was present in. Ruth put her fork down and stood up. 22 people did the thing that rooms do when one person stands without being called on. The slight collective reorientation of attention, the suspension of secondary conversations, the particular quiet of a space waiting to find out what comes next. Mr. Walt has told this accurately, she said. Her voice came out at the volume she intended, which was the volume Henry Ashford had used when addressing a room he had not asked to address, but was addressing anyway, because the alternative was allowing a misapprehension to stand uncorrected. I was put off the Denver and Rio Grande Western in November, without appropriate equipment, in conditions that would not have allowed me to survive the night without help. Cole Maddox found me on the tracks and offered an arrangement, my labor in exchange for shelter through the winter. I accepted it because it was the only viable option available to me, and because it was on its merits a fair exchange. She looked at the man in the new suit at the far end. He met her gaze without flinching. He knew who he was and why he was here and was not trying to hide either, which made him more dangerous than someone who was, because a man who is comfortable being seen has already decided he cannot be stopped. The legal matter Mr. Walt mentioned is a matter of record. My father borrowed money. He died before he could resolve it. The firm holding the debt collected through legal means. Whether they collected honestly is a question I have been pursuing with an attorney in Denver and will continue to pursue. She looked around the table. I mention this not because it is anyone's business in this room, but because if it is going to be discussed, I prefer to be present when it happens. The room held its quiet. I butchered 2 bull elk this past winter, she said. I ran a trapline at 9,000 feet in temperatures that had no interest in my preferences. I helped hold a cabin door against a gale that was winning before I got to it, and I kept a fire burning through 4 days when neither of us would have survived without it. She picked her fork back up. I am going to Denver to meet with an attorney who believes there is still something that can be done about the honest record of my father's life and work, and I intend to find out if he is right. The quiet held for 4 seconds. Then Agnes Pruitt, from the far end of the table, set her fork down deliberately and struck it once against her water glass. A single clear note. Then she brought her hands together twice, not applause as performance. The physical action of a person who has reached a conclusion and is communicating it without ambiguity. The man beside her followed, then 3 people across from them. Not everyone. This was a real room with real people. Some faces still neutral or still deciding. And the man in the new suit did not move at all. But he looked down at his plate for the first time, and did not look at Ruth again for the remainder of the evening. Enough people responded to constitute a thing the room could hear. She sat down. Cole beside her had not moved during any of it. He was looking at his plate when she sat back down and did not look at her immediately. But after a deliberate moment, the same quality of deliberateness he applied to everything that mattered, he picked up his coffee cup and set it back down, the sound quiet enough that only she could hear it. And the sound meant nothing except that he was there and he knew what she had done, and he was not going to mark it with words because words would have been less, not more. Marshall Carver, 2 seats down, looked at Ruth for a moment, then at his supper, and said to no one in particular. Anyone heard the condition of the road south past the junction, and the table reorganized itself around this new topic, and the evening continued, and the man in the new suit left before the coffee was poured. After the dining room closed and Black Ridge settled into its nighttime quiet, Ruth and Cole sat on the front steps of Agnes Pruitt's establishment, where Agnes had arranged lodging without making it a production. The April night was cold but not punishing, the creek audible at the east edge of town, running fast and purposeful in the dark. The first sheet says the debt is satisfied, Ruth said. I'm released from any financial obligation. According to Whitfield and Sons, I'm free. Cole looked at the main street of Black Ridge. Empty now except for a dog navigating the mud with the philosophical patience of an animal that has made its peace with the conditions. According to them, Bassett's letter is different. There's a witness, irregularities in the original documentation. Someone at Whitfield and Sons thought they'd hidden it well enough. She put her hands in her coat pockets. The 90-day window he mentioned has closed. But Bassett didn't write to tell me nothing could be done. He wrote because something still can be done. A lawyer with only one mechanism doesn't write letters after that mechanism expires. Cole's was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was working through something, not absent but interior, running calculations she could not see but had learned to wait for them. What do you need from Black Ridge before you go? She looked at him. The question had a shape she recognized, a question doing more than one thing at once, answering something even as it asked something else. He was not asking about provisions. He was telling her that when she was ready to leave for Denver, he would not be the thing standing between her and leaving. I already sent the letter to Bassett, she said, and there are things in Denver he has been holding. My father's manuscript, some personal effects that Whitfield and Sons couldn't collect because they had no commercial value. She paused. I want to get them back. Then we go to Denver, we again. She had said it first in the clearing when Walt arrived, not accidentally, and he had heard it and responded to it, and was now returning it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything he chose to do. You don't have to come, she said. I know I don't have to. He looked at the street. Something shifted in how he held himself on the step, a settling that was not quite relaxation but was the beginning of it. I need to buy rope. Summer configuration for the upper trapline exceeds current stock, she waited, and there's a harness fitting I've been meaning to address for the brown mare. She waited more. Denver has a better selection than Black Ridge for both. Cole. He looked at her. You have rope. You bought 3 coils from Agnes in October. And the harness fitting is serviceable. I watched you check it last week. She held his gaze. You don't need to explain any of this with rope. He looked at the creek at the east edge of town, water moving fast and purposeful through the dark, going somewhere with the certainty of things that know exactly where they belong. Then carefully. The way a man speaks when he has not spoken about something for long enough that the words require finding rather than choosing. I stopped counting on anything I couldn't account for. After Della. That was the arrangement I made with myself. He paused. You are not something I can account for. You are not a variable with any limit I can calculate. Another pause, longer. And I have been on that mountain looking at the same tree line for 4 years, and I had decided that was sufficient. Until it wasn't. Until you fell off a train and changed what sufficient means. She held this for a moment. This was not the language of parlors or dinner tables or social performances of people who have learned to say love-adjacent things without meaning them particularly. This was a man who had spent 4 years choosing silence over every available alternative, and was now choosing something else, and the choice was visible in the cost of it. "I'm still not something you can account for," she said. "No." The corners of his eyes shifted slightly. Not a smile, but the geology of a face that remembers what smiling feels like beginning to relearn the direction. "That's the whole of it." She put her hand on the step between them. Not on his hand. On the step, the wood cold and rough under her palm. He put his hand on the step beside hers. Not touching, adjacent. The creek ran in the dark and the April cold settled around them, and they sat like that for a while without needing it to be anything other than what it was. Bassett's office was on a quiet street 3 blocks from the Capitol building, in a structure that appeared to predate most of what surrounded it, and had no interest in updating its position. Bassett himself was in his mid-50s, wearing his intelligence without display and his caution visibly, which she read in the first 3 minutes and confirmed over the following 2 hours. The kind of lawyer who understood the difference between what the law said and what the law did, and had organized his practice around the gap between those two things. Cole had come into the waiting room and arranged himself into the chair beside the window with the resigned practicality of a very large man in furniture built for smaller people, his knees at an angle that left no question about the chair's inadequacy. He had the 2-month-old copy of the Rocky Mountain News he had found on the side table, and was reading it with the unhurried attention of a man who has nowhere specific to be, and has decided this is a reasonable use of time. The chair creaked under his weight. The office boy at the reception desk glanced at him twice with the expression of someone running a quiet structural assessment. In the inner office, Bassett had more than the letter had indicated. The witness. A former clerk of Whitfield and Sons who had processed the original loan documentation in 1877, had provided a sworn statement detailing 2 specific clauses that had not been present in the document at primary signing, and had appeared in the final recorded version. The witness had a personal copy of the original draft made before the final version was submitted, held for 6 years because he had known when he made it that he would eventually need it. Whitfield and Sons had not known about the copy. This was the kind of mistake people made when they believed the story they were telling was the only story available. Ruth sat across Bassett's desk and read through the documentation with the attention she had learned from years at the edge of her father's desk. She was reading the second document when she found it. Not something Bassett had pointed to. Something he had apparently been waiting to see whether she would locate herself. "This clause," she said, setting her finger on a paragraph near the bottom of the page. "The compound interest provision. It was added after the primary signing. Your witness confirms that. But the rate specified in this provision is above the maximum permitted under Colorado state law as of 1877. Bassett looked at her over his glasses. "Go on. Which means that even if the clause had been part of the original document, which it wasn't, but even if it had been, it would have been unenforceable. The entire debt calculation that Whitfield and Sons presented to the court was based on a compounded figure that included interest at a rate Colorado law did not permit." "That is correct. You knew this. I knew this. I wanted to see if you would find it." "Why?" "Because the process I am proposing requires someone who can do exactly what you just did, in front of people who are very good at making simple things appear complicated." He folded his hands on the desk. "The money is gone, Miss Ashford. I will not pretend otherwise. The liquidation is complete, and there is no mechanism to reverse it, but the record can be corrected." A deposition record submitted to the court that approved the original collection, presenting evidence of procedural fraud and an unlawful interest calculation. Under Colorado state law, there is no time limitation on the submission of corrective testimony to the public record. It does not give you the business back. It gives your father's name back, and it puts on record permanently what Whitfield and Sons actually did. She held this for a moment. 31 years. A rented cot and $40 of borrowed capital, and the slow accumulation of something built honestly from the ground up. The record of it, currently written by the people who had taken it, and records were what remained after everything else was gone. The record was the last thing anyone could still get right. "The deposition process," she said. 2 more visits to Denver minimum. Your testimony regarding your father's business practices and your own knowledge of the original loan circumstances. Precise testimony. I will need you to describe in exact detail the conversation you had with Crane at Whitfield and Sons. I was precise when it happened. I have been precise about it in my memory since. I believe you. He opened a drawer and produced a wooden box, modest and functional. These are the personal effects I mentioned. The commercial value assessment excluded them from the liquidation. She lifted the lid. 7 books. Her father's copies, the ones from the shelf behind his desk. 2 on commercial law, 1 on accounting practice, 1 history of American business he had read 3 times and marked throughout in his neat small handwriting in the margins. And 3 novels she had read as a child that she had not known he had kept. The silver ring with the Ashford name engraved into the dark stone, and the manuscript. 400 and some pages of Henry Ashford's handwriting, slightly water-damaged at the top corner from some transit incident. The title on the first page in larger letters than the text. A practical guide to commercial agreements in the Western Territories for the use of business persons who cannot afford a lawyer for every question. He had been working on it for 3 years. She had watched him at the desk with it in the evenings, seen him cross out and rewrite, and occasionally set his pen down and look at the wall in the way he looked at walls when he was trying to find the honest version of something complicated. He had not finished it. Approximately 60% complete by her estimate. The chapters on partnership agreements and the provisions relevant to land ownership were complete and clean. The later chapters were in various states of draft. She could finish the later chapters. She had read everything he had read. She had sat beside him while he thought through most of it. She knew what he was trying to say in the places where the draft had not yet found its final form, because she had absorbed the thinking before the words arrived and could trace the shape of what was missing. She held the manuscript for a moment, then placed it carefully in the canvas bag she had brought. Cole was on his feet when she came through the door, the Rocky Mountain News set aside, a man who at his full height made the office's low ceiling seem like a considered design choice rather than a standard one. He looked at the canvas bag and the wooden box and read what they meant without requiring explanation. Bassett has what he needs, she said. 2 more trips to Denver. Maybe something at the end of maybe not, but the record can be corrected either way. She paused. And I have my father's manuscript. Is it what you expected? Better. He was more honest on the page than he was in conversation. He wrote for people who were starting from nothing. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. And he wrote like someone who remembered exactly what that felt like. Cole held the door for her, and they walked out onto the Denver street together in the afternoon light, and the city's noise came at her from every direction. The sound of a place that has decided it is becoming something, and is throwing its full weight behind the decision. She had learned a different sound during 5 months on a mountain, and the city sound was now layered over that one like a language she still knew but was no longer thinking in them. They walked to the printer Bassett had recommended, 2 blocks west of the Capitol. And Ruth left the manuscript with a man named Graves who assessed documents by the quality of their handwriting before their content, and who said when he had looked at the first 3 pages that he would need 2 weeks to give her a proper estimate. She left her name in Black Ridge as a contact address and told him she would be in Denver again within the month. On the boardwalk outside the printers, Cole said the rope situation. She looked at him. I should address it before we leave Denver. There is a supply merchant on the north end of the commercial district. Cole. He looked at her. You have rope, she said. You have a serviceable harness fitting and adequate stock for every configuration that Trapline has run in 5 years. She waited. You came down the mountain. You came to Black Ridge and sat through Walt's supper conversation. You are standing on a Denver street in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She held his gaze. You do not need to explain any of that with rope. He looked at the street ahead of them. At the buildings going up on the far side, scaffolding and fresh lumber and the sound of construction that doesn't stop for anything. And something in the set of his shoulders changed, a releasing of something held at a specific tension for a long time. I stopped counting on anything I couldn't account for, he said. And these were not the same words he had used on Agnes's steps in Black Ridge, but they were the same territory. Only more of it visible now because they were standing in the middle of a city he had also once left behind. And the leaving was present in how he stood in it, navigating rather than inhabiting. Della died and I arranged everything so the only variables were ones I could calculate. The weather, the seasons, the trap line, things with known edges, a pause. And then you fell off a train and you had no known edges at all. And I made a calculation on the railroad tracks in November that I did not fully understand at the time. What did you understand at the time? That the temperature was going to drop another 15 degrees before midnight and you were going to die in those shoes. He looked at her. What I did not understand was everything that came after them. She looked at him in the afternoon light on the Denver street. This enormous man, large enough that people on the boardwalk stepped around him the way water steps around a rock, standing in the middle of a city that clearly remembered a time before he left it, and was not sure what to make of his return. What he had just said was the most direct accounting of an interior state she had heard from him in 5 months, which, given the precision of everything else he said, carried the weight of something said only once and meant completely. She put the canvas bag down on the boardwalk and set the wooden box beside it and held out her hand, not to be helped over rough ground, not as a transaction. The way you hold out a hand when you are offering something and leaving the decision entirely to the other person, with no guarantee of outcome and no pressure applied. He looked at her hand, then he took it, not as a conclusion, as a beginning, which was the only honest way to take someone's hand when you were both standing in the middle of something that had already started and still had most of its distance ahead of it. His hand was considerably larger than hers and had done things hers was still learning, and none of that mattered and all of it did. They stood on the Denver street in the afternoon light for a moment. Then Ruth picked up the canvas bag with her free hand and they walked north, because the afternoon was there and so were they, and some things did not require further explanation than that. The wedding happened in Black Ridge 6 weeks later, which was long enough for the community to have formed its opinions, and short enough that Walt was still in the area on his northern circuit and could serve as a witness. A role he accepted with the enthusiasm of someone given access to an event he would describe in detail for the next several years to everyone willing to listen, and several people who were not. Agnes Pruitt was the other witness. She wore her good dress and brought a jar of preserved plums from her personal stores as a gift, presented without ceremony and received by Ruth, with the knowledge that plums from Agnes Pruitt's personal stores carried more weight than most things offered, with considerable ceremony ever could. Judge Caleb Thorne had performed marriages in Black Ridge for 20 years, and had developed the ability to read whether a couple was going through a formality or doing something real. He was a small man, and when Cole Maddox stood before him to take his vows, Thorne had to look up at an angle that he managed with the professional composure of someone who had learned long ago to let the ceremony be larger than any circumstance surrounding it. Walt, standing to one side, came to approximately the level of Cole's collar and appeared not to notice them, which was either genuine unawareness or a considerable social grace. When Thorne asked Cole whether he accepted this woman, Cole looked at Ruth for the length of a full breath before he answered. I accepted her on a railroad track in November, he said. His voice the same low, unhurried register it always was, carrying no more weight than necessary and no less, when she was holding a hairpin and planning to use it on a mountain lion. Agnes Pruitt, standing to the left, produced a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same general territory, and came from a face that had not made that particular configuration in some time and appeared to find it agreeable. Ruth, standing in the dress Agnes had helped her assemble from the blue wool that had been in the general store's fabric stock since October, looked at this man, who had shot a warning round above a mountain lion on her behalf, and had not offered his hand on the slope and had placed his coat over her when she was sick, and had sat awake on the floor beside her, and had told her the worst thing wasn't starving, and had come down a mountain for the first time in 4 years, because she had used a word without thinking, and he had heard it and acted on it. And she felt in a place below the level of language the rightness of something that has arrived at exactly the moment it was ready to arrive and not a moment before. Yes, Thorne said, writing in his ledger, that counts. Some seasons pass in the way summers pass when the work fills them completely. Not quickly, not slowly, but in the absorbed manner of time too occupied to announce itself. They built the second room through June and July, the work generating its own arguments about window placement and structural sequencing that they resolved the way they resolved most disagreements, through the evidence of what actually worked rather than the prior conviction of either party. The second room had a desk. This had been Cole's addition, unannounced, a surprise she came home to from checking the trapline one morning. Solid surface large enough to hold the manuscript and the reference books both, positioned under the window with the best morning light, which Cole had known was the best morning light, because he had been observing which window it came through first for 4 years, before she arrived to benefit from the observation. Autumn brought the second deposition trip to Denver and then the third, and Bassett's confidence in the outcome grew with each visit until it was no longer qualified with any reservation. The court that had approved the original Whitfield and Sons collection received the corrective testament in September and took it under formal review. The money was gone. That remained true, and she had made her peace with its being true. But the record was no longer wrong. And the difference between those two things was larger than she had known how to measure until she saw it in writing with the court's notation attached. 31 years of honest work recorded honestly at last. Winter came back to the Colorado mountains in October with the authority it always had, as though the intervening months of spring and summer and the amber weeks of early fall were a negotiation it entertained once a year before reasserting the final terms. She completed the final chapters of her father's manuscript in November, working in the evenings by lamplight at the pine desk under the window, her shadow thrown long and steady on the log wall behind her. The later chapters were harder than she had expected and easier than she had feared. Harder because honesty requires precision, and precision requires effort, and effort costs something every time. Easier because she knew the material, the way you know things that have been in you long enough to become part of the structure rather than the content. She wrote what her father would have written if he had had the time, and in the places where she was not certain, she wrote the clearest, most honest version of what she understood, with the limits of that understanding named rather than hidden, because her father had spent 31 years building something on the foundation of not pretending to know what he didn't know, and she was not going to undermine that now. One evening in mid-December she set the pen down and sat back. The manuscript was complete. 431 pages of Henry Ashford's thinking and hers, laid down together in the order that made the most sense to both of them, for the people he had always been writing for. She looked at it for a moment in the lamplight without touching it. The feeling that arrived was not triumph, which was too loud for what this was, something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing that has been worth doing, which is different from the feeling of a thing that is finished. And she had learned this winter that the difference mattered. Cole came in from checking the exterior stovepipe, which had been collecting ice at the collar in the cold and required monitoring. He pulled the heavy door shut and knocked snow from his coat on the inside mat, moving through the doorframe with the slight automatic duck of a man who has spent enough time in low-ceilinged spaces that the adjustment happens before the thought. She heard all of this without looking up because she knew the sound of him moving through their shared space, the way she knew the fire level and the ice thickness and the quality of the morning light. She looked up when the sounds indicated he had settled. "The manuscript is finished," she said. He looked at her across the room, then at the pile of pages on the desk. He crossed the room and picked up the top page. Not to read it, just to hold it. The way you hold something to confirm it exists outside your wanting it to. His hand, large enough to cover most of the page, held it with the care he brought to everything that mattered. He would have been pleased, Cole said. He set the page back down with the same care. "Yes," she paused. "There's something else I want to tell you." He looked at her with the full attention he rationed carefully, the kind he reserved for things that required it, which was everything and nothing at once, and which she had stopped trying to categorize and simply received. "Spring," she said. Her voice carried the same weight she gave to true things, not louder than ordinary things, just steadier, more certain of the ground it was standing on. "There will be someone else here by spring." In the silence that followed, something moved across Cole Maddox's face that had not been there before, something real and immediate and unguarded. The expression of a man for whom a single piece of information has arrived and rearranged everything he thought he understood about the shape of what was coming. Not slowly, all at once. The way a landscape changes when the light shifts from behind a cloud and reveals what was always there. He stood at the desk for a moment, very still. Then he moved to the bookshelf, not to the books, to the small wooden box he had placed there after the blizzard, the one she had watched him carry in from storage and set beside Della's journal with the care of someone handling something that is simultaneously very heavy and very fragile. He took it down and brought it to the table and set it in front of her and opened the lid. Inside, on a square of cotton batting, was a piece of fabric, small, printed with yellow flowers on a white ground. Not the piece on his wrist, which was smaller now, worn down by years of washing and wearing to a fragment he kept against his sternum. This was an earlier version, larger, colors less faded, the original or close enough that the difference did not matter. She said yellow was the color that made everything else look like it was trying too hard, he said. His voice had the quality of someone returning to a language they set down a long time ago, finding each word with care not because the language was difficult, but because it mattered too much to rush. Said it plainly. Like it was obvious. Like any person paying attention would have reached the same conclusion and was a fool for needing it said. Ruth looked at the fabric. Looked at the slight outline of the smaller piece against his chest through the flannel. Looked at him. We'll tell them about her, she said. About Della. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. This man who had been the only variable in his own system for 4 years. Who had arranged everything to exclude what he could not account for. Who had found her on a railroad track in November and made a calculation and offered terms and had not anticipated that the terms would rewrite everything he thought he had finished wanting. And something in his face that had been held in a specific position for a long time released quietly and without drama, the way ice releases from a ledge in April. Not breaking, just letting go of what it had been holding against, becoming what it was going to be. Yes, he said. The simplest word in the language, carrying everything the last year had been moving toward and everything it was now pointing toward, said by a man who had never once used a word he did not mean entirely. She put her hand on the wooden box, then on his hand beside it. His hand closed over hers, careful and complete, the way he did everything that mattered. Outside, snow was beginning. She could hear it against the logs, the particular soft percussion of the first serious snow of winter arriving without apology. Settling over the ridge and the tree line and the trap line and the 2 graves in the spruce, stand behind the cabin and the road south toward Black Ridge and Denver, and all the distance between this mountain and the world each of them had come from. The stove would need banking before morning. The woodpile was adequate. The trap line would want checking in 3 days. All of this she knew without deciding to know it. The lamp burned. The stove held its warmth. And in the second room, on the pine desk under the window with the best morning light, 431 pages of honest work waited to be sent out into the world. A dead man's knowledge made available at last to the people he had written it for, completed by the hands of the daughter who had learned in the space between November and spring that some things are worth finishing even when the person who began them is gone, especially then. The snow said what snow always says, everything.